He rescued a wounded native girl. The next morning, 7 others arrived at the veteran rancher's gate. The blood trail led straight to his front porch, dark drops still wet in the desert sand. When Marcus Webb found the wounded Navajo girl collapsed against his water trough, he thought he was simply helping an injured stranger. But the 7 riders who appeared at dawn would reveal a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about survival in the Arizona Territory. The September heat still lingered in the high desert of northern Arizona, as Marcus completed his evening rounds around the remote ranch he had carved from the wilderness over the past 22 years. At 58 years old, he moved with the economical grace of a man who had learned that wasted motion in the desert could mean the difference between life and death. His weathered hands bore the permanent calluses of someone who had built everything he owned with his own labor, and his gray eyes held the constant alertness of a veteran who had survived both the Apache Wars and 3 decades of frontier solitude. Marcus had established his ranch in 1853 after mustering out of the territorial cavalry, choosing a location that provided natural defenses while remaining close enough to the seasonal water sources that sustained life in this harsh landscape. His spread encompassed nearly 4,000 acres of seemingly barren terrain that actually supported a surprising variety of hardy vegetation and wildlife for those who understood the desert's subtle rhythms. The ranch buildings reflected both practicality and permanence. A substantial stone house with thick walls designed to stay cool during the scorching summers and warm during the surprisingly cold winter nights. A large barn constructed from timber hauled over 100 miles from the mountain forests. Corrals built to withstand both the elements and the occasional raids by mountain lions or bears, and a sophisticated system of water collection and storage that allowed him to maintain his livestock during the long dry seasons. Marcus ran a modest but profitable operation centered around breeding horses that could survive the demanding conditions of frontier life. His animals were prized throughout the territory for their endurance, intelligence, and ability to thrive on sparse forage while carrying heavy loads across treacherous terrain. He also maintained a small herd of cattle and kept enough chickens and goats to provide variety in his diet and additional income during his occasional trips to the territorial settlements. The isolation had been exactly what Marcus needed after years of military service that had shown him more violence and death than any man should witness. He had lost his closest friends during brutal campaigns against hostile Apache bands, and the experience had left him with a deep wariness of forming new emotional attachments. The ranch provided a refuge where he could work with his hands, live according to his own principles, and avoid the complicated human relationships that seemed to inevitably lead to loss and disappointment. For over 2 decades, Marcus had maintained his solitary existence with minimal contact with the outside world. He made quarterly trips to the trading posts in Flagstaff and Prescott to sell horses and purchase supplies he could not produce himself. But these journeys were brief and businesslike. He had developed a reputation as a man who kept his word, minded his own affairs, and expected others to extend the same courtesy. The local Navajo bands had long since accepted Marcus's presence in their traditional territory, recognizing that he posed no threat to their way of life, and that he treated the land with the respect it demanded. Occasionally, he encountered Navajo travelers passing through his valley, and these meetings were conducted with mutual wariness, but without hostility. Marcus had learned enough of their language to engage in basic communication, and he had developed a pragmatic understanding of the complex political situation that kept both Navajo and white communities in a state of constant tension. On this particular evening, as Marcus completed his routine inspection of his fences and water sources, he noticed that his horses seemed unusually agitated. The animals were clustered at the far end of their pasture, ears pricked forward and nostrils flared as they tested the air for scents that suggested danger. Marcus had learned to trust his animals' instincts, as they often detected threats long before human senses could identify them. As he approached the main house to investigate what might be disturbing his livestock, Marcus noticed dark spots on the ground that looked distinctly like blood. The droplets formed an irregular trail that led from the edge of his property toward the front of his house, where his primary water trough provided the only reliable drinking water for miles in any direction. Following the blood trail with growing concern, Marcus discovered a young Navajo woman collapsed against the stone base of his water trough. She appeared to be unconscious, or barely conscious, and even in the fading light, He could see that she had suffered significant injuries. Her traditional clothing was torn and stained with blood, and her long black hair was matted with dust and dried blood that suggested she had been traveling for some time while wounded. Marcus approached cautiously, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt revolver he always carried on his hip. However, the woman posed no obvious threat, and his immediate concern was determining the extent of her injuries and whether she might survive without immediate medical attention. Kneeling beside the unconscious woman, Marcus could see that she appeared to be in her early 20s, with the high cheekbones and strong features characteristic of Navajo heritage. She had suffered what looked like a gunshot wound to her left shoulder, and there were additional cuts and bruises that suggested she had been in some kind of violent altercation. Her breathing was shallow but regular, and her pulse, while weak, seemed steady. "Miss, can you hear me?" Marcus asked in English, then repeated the question in the limited Navajo he had learned over the years. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, revealing dark pupils that struggled to focus on his face. She tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper in Navajo that Marcus could not fully understand, though he caught words that seemed to relate to danger and pursuit. Realizing that the woman needed immediate medical attention that was beyond his limited field medicine skills, Marcus carefully lifted her and carried her into his house. He placed her on his own bed, then set about cleaning and dressing her wounds with the basic medical supplies he kept for treating injured animals and the occasional cuts and burns that were inevitable parts of ranch life. The gunshot wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening, as the bullet appeared to have passed through the fleshy part of her shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. However, the wound was several hours old and showed signs of infection that concerned Marcus greatly. He cleaned it as thoroughly as possible with whiskey and hot water, then applied a poultice made from desert plants that he had learned could help prevent infection. As he worked to stabilize the woman's condition, Marcus found himself wondering about the circumstances that had brought her to his remote ranch. The nature of her injuries and her obvious exhaustion suggested that she had been fleeing from something or someone, and the fact that she had traveled alone across dangerous territory indicated that her situation was desperate. Throughout the night, Marcus maintained a careful vigil beside the wounded woman, checking her temperature, changing her bandages, and encouraging her to drink small amounts of water when she was conscious enough to swallow. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling in Navajo and occasionally opening her eyes to look at him with a mixture of confusion and wariness. During her more lucid moments, Marcus learned that her name was Ayana, which she translated as meaning eternal blossom in her language. She was able to communicate that she had been traveling with a small group when they were attacked by men who were not soldiers, but wore similar clothing and carried military weapons. She had escaped during the confusion of the attack, but she did not know the fate of her companions. "Bad men," she said in halting English during one of their conversations. "They want to take us away, force us to go to the reservation." Marcus understood that Ayana was referring to the ongoing efforts by territorial and federal authorities to relocate Navajo communities to designated reservation lands, often using methods that ranged from economic pressure to outright force. Many Navajo families had resisted these efforts, preferring to maintain their traditional ways of life in their ancestral territories, despite the risks involved. "How many men attacked your group?" Marcus asked. "Maybe 6, maybe 7. They had horses and guns. We were traveling to meet with other families when they found us." Marcus realized that Ayana's pursuers might still be in the area, searching for her, and possibly tracking her to his ranch. The thought of armed men approaching his property filled him with the same combat alertness that had kept him alive during his military service. As dawn approached, Marcus prepared for the possibility that Ayana's attackers might trace her blood trail to his ranch. He cleaned and loaded his weapons, positioned additional ammunition in strategic locations around his house, and secured his livestock in areas where they would be protected from stray gunfire. He also prepared a hidden cache of supplies in case he and Ayana needed to flee quickly. When the sun finally rose above the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Marcus was not surprised to see riders approaching his ranch from the direction Ayana had come. What did surprise him was that there were 7 of them, instead of the 6 or 7 attackers Ayana had described, and they were clearly Navajo rather than the white men who had presumably attacked her group. The riders approached slowly and deliberately, their hands visible and their weapons secured to show that they came in peace. They were all young adults, both men and women, wearing traditional Navajo clothing mixed with practical items acquired through trade with white settlers. Their horses showed signs of hard travel, and Marcus could see the tension in their postures that suggested they were prepared for trouble. The leader of the group was a tall young man who appeared to be in his mid-20s, with long black hair braided with silver ornaments and clothing that indicated high status within his community. He rode with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to leadership, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that Marcus immediately recognized and respected. "I am called Hostine Begay," the young man said in excellent English as he dismounted about 20 feet from Marcus's front porch. "We seek a woman of our people who was injured and may have come this way." Marcus stepped out of his house, his rifle held in a non-threatening position but ready for immediate use if the situation turned hostile. "She's here," Marcus replied. "She's badly wounded and needs medical attention." A visible wave of relief passed through the group of Navajo riders, and Marcus could see that their primary concern was Ayana's welfare rather than any hostile intentions toward him. "You helped her?" asked one of the women in the group, a striking young woman with intricate tattoos on her arms and silver jewelry that caught the morning sunlight. "I did what I could. She's stable, but she needs proper medical care." Hostine Begay studied Marcus carefully, as if trying to assess his character and motivations. "Why did you help her?" Many white men would have turned away or demanded payment. Marcus considered the question, realizing that his answer might determine whether this encounter remained peaceful or escalated into conflict. "Because she needed help, and I was able to provide it. That's reason enough." The simple honesty of Marcus's response seemed to satisfy the young Navajo leader, who nodded slowly and relaxed his defensive posture. "May we see her?" "Of course, but she's weak, and I don't want her condition to worsen from too much excitement." Marcus led the group into his house, where Ayana was awake and alert, despite her obvious pain and exhaustion. When she saw her companions, her face lit up with joy and relief, and she spoke rapidly in Navajo to explain her experiences and express her gratitude toward Marcus. As the reunion continued, Marcus learned more about the complex situation that had brought these young people to his ranch. They were members of a larger Navajo community that was attempting to maintain their traditional way of life while avoiding forced relocation to the reservation at Bosque Redondo, which had gained a reputation for poor conditions and high mortality rates. The woman with the intricate tattoos, who introduced herself as Maria, explained that their group had been traveling to a gathering where multiple Navajo communities would discuss strategies for dealing with increasing pressure from territorial authorities. "We were hoping to find a path that would allow our people to remain in our ancestral lands while satisfying the demands of the white government," Maria said. "But it seems that some men believe force is the only language we understand." Marcus learned that the attack on Ayana's group had been carried out by a private militia hired by territorial officials who wanted to demonstrate that resistance to relocation would not be tolerated. The militiamen had orders to capture Navajo families and transport them to reservation lands, using whatever methods they deemed necessary. "These men, they're not legitimate military?" Marcus asked. "No," replied Hostine Begay. "They are hired guns who care nothing for law or justice. They are paid by the territory to remove our people, and they use methods that regular soldiers would not accept." Marcus felt a familiar anger rising within him, the same outrage he had experienced during his military service when he witnessed unnecessary brutality directed against civilians. He had joined the territorial cavalry believing he was protecting innocent people, but he had gradually come to understand that the situation was far more complicated than simple conflicts between good and evil. "What do you plan to do about these militiamen?" Marcus asked. "We must protect our people," said another member of the group, a young man whose scarred hands indicated experience with weapons and combat. "If they continue to attack our families, we will have no choice but to fight back." Marcus understood the logic of their position, but he also recognized that open warfare between Navajo communities and territorial militias would likely result in massive casualties and would provide justification for even harsher measures against native populations. "Fighting might not be your best option," Marcus said carefully. "The territorial government wants an excuse to use more force against your people. If you give them that excuse, they'll bring in the regular army, and then your situation will become much worse." "Then what do you suggest?" asked Maria, her voice carrying a challenge that suggested she was testing Marcus's commitment to helping them. Marcus realized that he was being drawn into a complex political situation that could easily destroy the peaceful isolation he had maintained for over 2 decades. However, he also recognized that these young people were facing an injustice that demanded a response from anyone with the means to help. "Let me think about it," Marcus said. "There might be other ways to deal with this problem." Over the following days, as Ayanna recovered from her injuries under the care of her companions and Marcus's continued medical attention, the group of young Navajo adults remained at the ranch to ensure her safety and to plan their next moves. Marcus found himself increasingly involved in their discussions and planning, drawn by their intelligence, their dedication to protecting their families, and their willingness to consider alternatives to violence. During long conversations around his fireplace in the evenings, Marcus learned about the complex web of economic, political, and cultural factors that were driving the conflicts between Navajo communities and territorial authorities. The young people possessed a sophisticated understanding of both traditional Navajo governance and contemporary American political systems, and they were actively seeking solutions that could satisfy both sets of requirements. Faustin Begay emerged as a particularly thoughtful and strategic leader who commanded respect from his companions while remaining open to new ideas and approaches. He had received education at a mission school, but had chosen to return to his traditional community rather than assimilate into white society, and he brought a unique perspective that combined knowledge of both cultures. "The problem is not that our people cannot adapt to change," Faustin Begay explained during one of their discussions. "The problem is that the changes being forced upon us are designed to destroy everything that makes us who we are." Maria, who Marcus learned was a skilled diplomat as well as a fierce warrior, added her own perspective on the challenges facing their communities. "We are willing to find ways to coexist with white settlers, but only if we can maintain our connection to our ancestral lands and our traditional ways of governing ourselves." As Marcus listened to their stories and explanations, he began to understand that the young people represented a new generation of Navajo leadership that was trying to navigate between traditional values and contemporary realities. They were not simply resisting change, but fighting for the right to control the pace and nature of that change. "What would it take to convince the territorial authorities to leave your communities alone?" Marcus asked during one of their planning sessions. "Proof that we pose no threat to white settlers," replied Ayanna, who had recovered enough to participate actively in the discussions, "and demonstration that we can contribute to the economic development of the territory." Marcus realized that the young people had already developed a comprehensive strategy for achieving peaceful coexistence, but they lacked the political connections and credibility necessary to present their proposals to territorial officials. As a white veteran with an established reputation for integrity, Marcus could potentially provide the access and legitimacy they needed. "I might be able to help you get a hearing with the right people," Marcus said, though he was uncertain about the wisdom of involving himself so deeply in such a complex situation. The conversation that followed lasted deep into the night, as the group explored the possibilities and risks associated with Marcus serving as their advocate and intermediary. They developed a plan that would involve Marcus traveling to the territorial capital to present their proposals, while the young people worked to build support within Navajo communities for their approach. However, their planning was interrupted by the arrival of unwelcome visitors. 3 days after the group's arrival at Marcus's ranch, the militiamen who had attacked Ayanna's original party tracked them to his property. Unlike the peaceful approach taken by the Navajo group, the militiamen arrived with weapons drawn and hostile intentions clearly visible. The leader of the militia was a large man with the bearing of someone accustomed to using violence to solve problems. He wore a mixture of military and civilian clothing that suggested unofficial status, and his companions showed the same lack of formal military discipline that characterized hired gunmen, rather than legitimate soldiers. "We're looking for a group of hostile Indians who attacked a territorial survey party," the militia leader announced without dismounting from his horse. "We have information that they might be hiding on your property." Marcus stepped out of his house with his rifle clearly visible, his expression calm but alert. "There are no hostile Indians on my property. However, there are several Navajo guests who came here seeking medical attention for an injured woman." "Same thing," the militiaman replied. We have orders to transport all Navajo individuals to the reservation for processing. Under whose authority? Marcus asked, his voice carrying the tone of command he had developed during his military service. Territorial authority. These Indians are illegally occupying government land and pose a threat to legitimate settlers. Marcus knew that the militiaman's claims were legally questionable at best, but he also understood that legal technicalities would mean little if the situation escalated to violence. He could see Hosteen Begay and his companions positioning themselves strategically around his property, prepared for a fight, but clearly hoping to avoid one. I suggest you verify your authority before attempting to arrest anyone on my property, Marcus said. As a territorial resident and property owner, I have the right to host guests of my choosing. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with both sides clearly prepared for violence, but neither wanting to make the first move. Marcus could see that the militiamen were outnumbered and uncertain about their legal authority, while the Navajo group was determined to protect Ayanna, but reluctant to initiate a conflict that could endanger their broader community. The situation was resolved when Marcus made a calculated decision that drew on his military experience and his understanding of how unofficial authority actually worked in the territory. "I'll tell you what," Marcus said to the militia leader. "I'll accompany you to the territorial capital to discuss this situation with the proper authorities. We can determine whether your orders actually give you jurisdiction over my property and my guests." The offer caught the militiaman off guard, as he had clearly expected either immediate compliance or armed resistance rather than a legalistic challenge to his authority. "That's not necessary," the militiaman replied, but Marcus could hear uncertainty in his voice. "I think it is necessary. In fact, I insist on it. As a veteran and property owner, I have the right to demand clarification of any military or civilian orders that affect my property." Faced with the prospect of having to justify his actions to legitimate territorial authorities, the militia leader chose to withdraw rather than risk exposure of what were clearly questionable orders and methods. "This isn't over," he warned as his group prepared to leave. "Those Indians are going to the reservation one way or another." After the militiamen departed, Marcus and his Navajo guests spent considerable time discussing the implications of the encounter and planning their next moves. It was clear that the militia would return with either reinforcements or more legitimate authority, and that the young people could not remain safely at the ranch indefinitely. "We must leave soon," Hosteen Begay acknowledged. "Our presence here puts you in danger, and we cannot ask you to risk your safety for our problems." However, Marcus had reached a different conclusion during the confrontation with the militia. He realized that his comfortable isolation was no longer sustainable in a territory where injustice was being carried out in the name of progress and civilization. "I've been thinking," Marcus said. "Maybe it's time for me to get more involved in territorial politics. Someone needs to speak up for people who are being treated unfairly." The conversation that followed would change Marcus's life as dramatically as his decision to help Ayanna had already begun to transform his daily existence. The young Navajo adults had brought him more than just company and purpose. They had brought him the opportunity to use his experience and status to make a meaningful difference in the lives of people who truly needed an advocate. Over the following weeks, Marcus would find himself traveling to territorial capitals, meeting with officials, and building coalitions of support for peaceful coexistence between Navajo communities and white settlers. The work was challenging and often frustrating, but it gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life since his military service ended. The wounded girl he had rescued became not just a friend, but a symbol of the possibility that individual acts of compassion could grow into larger movements for justice and understanding. And the 7 others who had arrived at his gate became the family he had never expected to find, united not by blood, but by shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable and building a better future for all the peoples of the territory.